My name is Jolene Sims, and I was 36 years old when I discovered that my family had quietly assigned a price tag to my life, a price I had never agreed to pay. The night I lost the biggest contract my company had ever signed, my sister didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask whether I'd eaten. She didn't even ask what happened. Instead, her first question was, "So, who's going to make my car payment now?" My mother nodded as if that was the real crisis. A few minutes later, my father walked into my old bedroom, pulled a cardboard storage box from the closet shelf, and calmly began folding my clothes into it. He looked at me and said, "Your sister needs this house more than you do." None of them had any idea what I had already built 3 hours down the coast. None of them knew whose name was written on the deed of a quiet little house overlooking the ocean. Over the next few weeks, everything they believed about me, and everything they'd built their expectations on, came crashing down one board at a time. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, the place where quiet people finally stop carrying the weight of everyone else's expectations. If you've ever been valued only for what you could provide, stay with me until the end. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories. Let me take you back to a Friday afternoon in late spring. I own a company called Titleline Property Restoration. We specialize in restoring coastal homes damaged by hurricanes, saltwater, and years of relentless storms. Rotten floor joists, salt-eaten siding, cracked foundations, collapsed decks. If the ocean tries to destroy a home, my team brings it back to life. I started the business with nothing more than an old pickup truck, a borrowed nail gun, and more determination than common sense. Over the years, that little operation grew into something I was genuinely proud of. Then, one Friday morning, everything changed. My biggest client called. His investors had pulled out. The luxury resort restoration project we'd been preparing for months was cancelled. One phone call erased nearly a quarter of my expected annual revenue. I sat quietly in my office overlooking the harbor in Mara Bay and stared at the numbers on my screen. Then I closed the laptop. I'd rebuilt homes the ocean had nearly swallowed whole. I could rebuild a business too. The money wasn't what hurt. What hurt was knowing I couldn't tell anyone in my family because nobody had ever cared enough to ask what I actually did for a living. To them, I worked construction. Close enough. Eventually I stopped correcting them. Every Friday evening, I made the same 3-hour drive inland to the small town of Mill Haven, where I'd grown up. 18 months earlier, my father had suffered a heart attack. I moved back into my childhood bedroom to help my parents while keeping my business running from the coast. During the week, I managed restoration crews. Every weekend, I became the dependable daughter. I lived 2 completely different lives. That Friday evening, when I turned into my parents' driveway, I immediately noticed 2 unfamiliar vehicles parked outside. My cousin Dell's pickup, and my sister Brittany's boyfriend Cody's rusty Dodge Charger. In my family, unexpected guests on a Friday usually meant one thing. A decision had already been made, and I was about to be the last person informed. The screen door slammed behind me as I walked inside. Before I could even set my keys down, Brittany's voice echoed through the living room. "So, it's true. You got fired." She sat curled up on the corner of the couch, scrolling through her phone. Cody leaned back beside her with a smug grin. My mother, Carol, sat comfortably in her favorite armchair. Even our neighbor, Mrs. Ellis, happened to be there with a glass of sweet tea, pretending she wasn't enjoying the drama unfolding in front of her. "I wasn't fired," I replied calmly. "My client lost his funding. The project was cancelled. I was laid off from one job, not my business." Brittany barely looked up. She waved her hand dismissively before turning to Mom. "So who's paying my car this month?" That was it. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "That must be hard." Just another bill they expected me to handle. Mom placed her teacup on the table and folded her hands with the practiced expression she always wore when she'd already made up her mind. "Now, Jolene," she said gently, "don't get upset. We'll figure something out." I couldn't help letting out a small laugh. No, I answered. You'll figure something out. I'm done being everyone's solution. Cody smirked without lifting his eyes from his phone. Near the kitchen doorway, my cousin Dell looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Concern, regret, maybe even a warning. I looked around the room. How did everyone already know about the contract? Yes. Brittany shrugged. Cody's cousin works at the supply yard. News travels fast. Something about the way she smiled told me this conversation wasn't really about my job. It was about what they believed they'd lost. And I had a feeling the worst part was still coming. It is. I opened the folder and spread the papers across my desk. Property records, bank statements, insurance documents, and one deed with my name printed clearly across the top. A small blue house overlooking the bay. Fully paid off 3 years earlier. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't flashy. But every mortgage payment, every repair, every late night had come from work my family barely believed existed. They still think you swing a hammer for somebody else, Renata said. They think I'm barely getting by. And you're going to tell them. I looked out the office window toward the dark water. Waves rolled in under the moonlight, steady and patient. No, I said. I'm done explaining myself to people who never wanted to understand. She smiled. Then what? I picked up my phone and opened my calendar. Monday, we replaced the resort contract. You already have a lead. I have 3. That weekend became one of the busiest we'd ever had. I called every property manager, every developer, every insurance adjuster I'd worked with over the years. By Tuesday afternoon, 2 emergency restoration jobs were signed. By Friday, another commercial contract filled nearly half the revenue we'd lost. The business kept moving. My family never asked. Instead, my phone filled with messages from Brittany. Can you still help with the car payment? Just this month. Mom says you're being stubborn. I read every message. Answered none. On Wednesday, my father finally called. His voice sounded older than I remembered. Your mother thinks you overreacted. Waited. He cleared his throat. You know. Your sister's under a lot of pressure. So was I. Silence. I didn't know you felt that way. You never asked. Another silence stretched between us. I should probably let you go, he muttered. Okay. The call ended after barely 2 minutes. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just another conversation where the truth stood in the room while everyone looked somewhere else. Renata leaned against my office door after I hung up. Any different? No. You disappointed. I thought about it for a moment. Well, for the first time in years, I wasn't disappointed. I was simply finished waiting. That Friday evening, instead of driving 3 hours inland, I stayed in Mara Bay. I grilled fresh fish on the back deck of my little house, listened to the ocean, and watched the sunset turn the water orange. No guilt. No emergency phone calls. No pretending someone else's crisis mattered more than my own life. Just peace. Sometimes the biggest revenge isn't exposing people. It's quietly building a life so full that their approval no longer has a place in it. I still wasn't sure what came next, but for the first time in 18 months, something inside me finally loosened. It felt like a rope I'd been pulling for miles had suddenly gone slack. But the cardboard box didn't appear out of nowhere. 18 months earlier, my father collapsed in the driveway with a heart attack. I got the call while I was supervising a restoration project on the coast. I dropped everything and drove the 3 hours back to Mill Haven without stopping. After that day, I never really left. Someone had to keep the household running while Dad recovered, and in my family, someone had always meant me. My mother didn't work. My younger sister, Brittany, drifted from one short-lived job to another, quitting before she could be fired. So I moved back into my old bedroom and quietly took over the responsibilities no one else wanted. I paid the overdue property taxes before the county could issue another notice. I caught up the homeowner's insurance that had quietly lapsed. When Brittany wanted a newer car but couldn't qualify for the loan, my mother slid the paperwork across the table and handed me a pen. Just co-sign, she said. It'll only be until she gets on her feet. I signed because I knew a default would hurt my credit as much as hers, and my business depended on that credit. I didn't do any of it to be praised. I did it because I hate watching something collapse when I know I can keep it standing. That's always been my weakness. Fix things. I'd rather carry the weight than argue about whose responsibility it is. I even tried setting boundaries once. Brittany takes over the payments after 6 months, I said the day we signed the loan. Mom barely looked up. She just needs a little time. The truth was, Brittany never had to stand on her own because someone was always there to catch her. Usually me. Meanwhile, everyone assumed I didn't need help because I always managed somehow. In our house, being the strong one wasn't a compliment. It was an excuse to ignore me. Every Friday, I drove those same 3 hours believing family was worth every sacrifice. I believed that. Right up until the night they packed my belongings into a cardboard box. People who hear this story often ask the same question. Why did your mother love Brittany more? The answer isn't as simple as favoritism. Before Brittany was born, my mother lost 2 pregnancies. She almost never talked about them, but my grandmother told me the story years ago. Those losses broke something inside her. Then Brittany arrived. Small, premature, and fighting to survive. From that moment on, Mom dedicated her entire life to protecting her youngest daughter. She made sure Brittany never struggled, never failed, and never faced consequences alone. Somewhere along the way, she decided I was different. I was the capable one. The dependable one. The daughter who would always figure things out. I understand why she became that person. Understanding it never made it hurt any less. My father carried his own scars. He grew up with a loud, controlling father who believed arguments were won by whoever shouted the longest. Dad learned early that peace came from staying quiet. When my mother spoke, he rarely disagreed. Not because he always believed she was right. Because he had spent a lifetime convincing himself silence was easier than conflict. The only person who truly saw me was my grandmother, Nana Marlene. When I was little, she'd pull me aside and whisper, "You were never the strong one to me, sweetheart. You were simply the one who always showed up." Those words stayed with me. By then, Nana was almost 80. She lived in the small bedroom at the back of the Mill Haven house, spending most of her days in a recliner beside the window. Age had taken her strength, but not her kindness. If I kept making that exhausting drive every weekend, it wasn't for my parents. It was for her. She was the only person in that house who still looked at me and saw exactly who I was. That first night back in Morro Bay, sleep never came. I sat alone at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and my laptop glowing in the dark. For months I'd carried my family. Now, for the first time, I started letting go. The automatic payments for the Mill Haven property taxes. Cancelled. The homeowner's insurance drafted from my business account. Cancelled. 2 clicks. 18 months of responsibility disappeared from my bank account in less than 30 seconds. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Didn't feel like revenge. It felt like finally putting down a weight I'd been carrying far longer than anyone had ever noticed. Then there was Brittany's car. For months, I'd been quietly making those payments myself. That night, I logged into the account and canceled the automatic payment. I knew being a co-signer wasn't something you could simply walk away from. The only real way to remove my name was for Brittany to refinance the loan herself. And we both knew she wouldn't qualify. So I did the only honest thing I could. I stopped paying. I sent her a simple message explaining that the payments were now her responsibility. If she chose to let the loan default, my credit would take the hit too. I accepted that risk. One damaged credit report was a smaller price than spending the next 15 years paying for someone else's life. Then I opened my banking app and made a list of every bill, subscription, insurance payment, and automatic transfer I had quietly been covering for that house. One by one I crossed them off. Property taxes. Cancelled. Homeowner's insurance. Cancelled. Utility transfers. Cancelled. By the time I closed my laptop, it had taken less than an hour. The invisible machine I'd been running behind the scenes for 18 months had finally stopped. They asked me to leave before sunset. By midnight, the foundation they'd been standing on had already begun to shift. They just didn't know it yet. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was simply stepping away. A wall can't keep holding up a house after it's been torn down. Before going to bed, I unlocked the folder I'd carried back from Mill Haven. Inside was a deed, nearly 3 years old, with my name printed across it. A small house overlooking the ocean, 40 minutes north of Mara Bay. No mortgage, no debt. I'd never told anyone. Not Brittany. Not my mother. Not my father. I traced the address with my finger for a long moment before closing the folder. Some dreams are safest when they're kept quiet. The strange thing about a house is that it rarely falls apart all at once. First a payment gets missed. Then a notice arrives. Then the phone rings in a kitchen 3 hours inland. Only then does someone realize they never really understood what had been holding the roof over their heads. I want to pause here for a moment. Some people have said I was cold that night. Maybe I was. But I'd spent 18 months being the warmth inside a house that saved all its comfort for everyone except me. If you've ever been the person carrying an entire family until your back finally gave out, then you already know exactly what it feels like to walk away. For 2 days, the house in Mill Haven was silent. No calls from my mother. No texts from my father. Brittany posted a picture of my old bedroom with a caption celebrating her new space. I didn't respond. Instead, I buried myself in work. That's what I've always done with pain. I turn it into progress. Renata and I chased every job we could find to replace the resort contract we'd lost. Storm-damaged duplex. A widow's collapsing front porch. Small projects. Honest work. The kind that pays on time and lets you sleep at night. On the 3rd morning, my cousin Dell called. Dell had always been the only person in the family willing to tell me the truth, even when nobody wanted it spoken aloud. "Hey," he said quietly. "Thought you should know. A bank letter came today." "What kind of letter?" "My aunt's been staring at it all morning. Something about a home equity line." A chill settled in my chest. "What home equity line?" Dell hesitated. "You didn't know?" "Know what, Dell? I figured you set it up. I have no idea what you're talking about." He sighed. "Look, maybe I shouldn't be the one telling you this, but your name came up. Your mom mentioned it." After we hung up, I sat perfectly still. Something was missing. Somewhere behind that front door, there was another secret. And somehow, my name was attached to it. I didn't know it yet, but the family that had pushed me out of their house had been leaning on me in ways I had never agreed to. Ways I hadn't even imagined. That afternoon, Brittany finally called. I almost ignored it. Some old habit made me answer. For one foolish second, I hoped she might ask how I was doing. Instead, she said, "Hey, my car insurance is due on Monday. Can you cover it?" Brittany asked without hesitation. "Mom also says the water heater is making a weird noise, so we'll probably need help with that too." No hello. No how are you. Not a single question that didn't end with a price tag. "Brittany," I said quietly, "do you even know where I am right now?" "I don't know. Somewhere near the beach. I'm 3 hours away, and I'm officially off your payroll." There was a long pause. I could hear Cody mumbling something in the background. "Don't be like that," Brittany finally said. "You always take care of this stuff." "I took care of it because no one else would," I replied. "That doesn't mean it was ever my responsibility." "So you're really going to let my car get repossessed over?" "What? Your feelings?" I almost laughed. "I'm not your bank, Brittany. I never was." Cody's voice became louder in the background. "Ask her about the other thing," he muttered. Brittany immediately tried to hush him. But I'd already heard enough. "The other thing?" "Yes." "What other thing?" "Nothing," Brittany answered far too quickly. "Forget it." Then she hung up. I set my phone on the desk and stared at it for a long time. My family had been following the same script for 15 years. I played the dependable daughter. The emergency fund. The open wallet. The person who always showed up. Now that I'd walked off the stage, everyone was confused because their lines no longer worked. The problem was, someone had written me into a role I never agreed to play. And Cody had just accidentally revealed there was another chapter one hadn't seen yet. That evening I sent the message I should have written years earlier. It was short, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. I addressed it to all three of them. Effective immediately, I will no longer be paying the property taxes, homeowner's insurance, or Brittany's car loan. Any future payments are your responsibility. If you have questions regarding the loan, please contact the bank directly. That was it. No anger. No long explanation. No apology. I'd learned something painful over the years. People who expect you to sacrifice in silence are rarely moved by your pain. They only notice when the sacrifices stop. Before I pressed send, I typed one final sentence. Family isn't a bill you pay. It's a door you keep open. And I'm done holding it open for people who only knock when they need something. I deleted that line. I didn't need them to read it. I only needed to read it myself. Then I hit send, turned my phone face down, and went back to work. The next morning, Renata glanced over my shoulder after reading the message. No soft edges, she said with an approving nod. Good. They're going to make you the villain. Shrugged. I've been carrying that house for 15 years. It's their turn to hold up the roof. I meant every word. But I also knew my mother. She wouldn't argue about the money. She'd argue about love. She would turn a spreadsheet into betrayal, a healthy boundary into cruelty. That had always been her greatest talent. And for 15 years. It had worked. As I watched the morning tide roll past the windows of the boathouse office, I found myself wondering one thing. Would it still work now? The answer arrived before noon. My mother called 6 times. I ignored the first 5. On the 6th I answered. She didn't mention the bills. She went straight for guilt. After everything this family has done for you, she snapped. This is how you repay us? I leaned back in my chair. What exactly has this family done for me, Mom? Silence. Long one. She searched for an answer. None came. Finally, she fell back on the only argument she'd ever known. You've always landed on your feet, Jolene. You don't need us the way your sister does. There it was again. The sentence I'd heard my entire life. Not because it was true. Because repeating it had always made it easier for everyone to take one more thing from me. She used that line like a hammer, the one she'd swung my entire life. I'm not doing anything to Brittany, I said. I simply stopped doing everything for her. Those are two different things. She could lose her car. Then she can make her payments like every other adult. Right on cue, my mother's voice cracked. Tears came as easily as turning on a faucet. I lost 2 babies, Jolene. You don't know what it's like to almost lose a child. It was the truest thing she'd ever said, yet somehow she still turned it into a weapon. I do understand, Mom, I answered quietly. I've understood my whole life. That's why I drove 3 hours every weekend for 18 months. That's why I put my own life on hold. But your grief isn't a debt I'm supposed to pay forever. Silence. Then she revealed where this conversation had been headed all along. We'll just celebrate your grandmother's birthday without you. Nana's 80th birthday. The entire family had been planning it, and my mother had already decided to turn it into another battlefield. I ended the call and stared out the boathouse window. As the tide rolled away from shore, a plan I'd been too afraid to consider for 3 years finally began taking shape. 2 days later I drove back to Mill Haven, but not for my parents. I entered through the side door that led directly to Nana Marlene's room, avoiding the living room completely. She was sitting in her recliner beside the window, a quilt tucked neatly over her knees. She looked smaller than I remembered, but the moment she saw me, her entire face lit up. "There's my girl," she whispered. I pulled a chair beside her and took her hand. Her skin had become thin as paper, but her grip still carried warmth. We talked about simple things, the birds at her feeder, the television show she'd been watching, the weather. Eventually she looked out the window at the gray Mill Haven sky. 80 years, she said with a soft laugh. Can you believe it? What do you want for your birthday? Yes. She smiled, though sadness lingered behind it. I only ever had one house that truly felt like home, she said. The little place by the water. Your grandfather and I bought it when we were newly married. We lost it when the hard years came. I'd heard the story before. This time it sounded less like a memory and more like a wish. The sea took almost everything from me, she continued. But that porch. I'd sit there every evening watching the sun disappear over the water and think, this is mine. No one can ever take it away. She squeezed my hand gently. It's funny what people remember when they get older. I didn't tell her what I already knew. Not yet. I simply stayed with her until the afternoon light faded across the room. On the drive back to the coast, I called my attorney about paperwork I'd been putting off for 3 years. There was something Nana still didn't know. 3 years earlier, the little beach house she'd lost had gone up for county auction. It was nearly falling apart. The porch sagged toward the sand. Salt water had eaten through the siding. Most buyers saw a teardown. I saw my grandparents' home. I emptied my savings and bought it. Since then, every spare dollar and every free weekend had gone into bringing it back to life. By the 3rd year, I had finally reached the original structure beneath decades of cheap renovations. No previous owner had bothered to restore the bones of the house. They painted over damage, covered problems, replaced fixtures. But no one had ever opened the walls. The day after visiting Nana, I drove to the property because demolition had always been the one thing that quieted my mind. I was removing an old section of plaster beside the original chimney when something unexpected happened. As the final board came loose, something hidden inside the wall slipped free. It struck the wooden floor with a heavy thud. Before the old chimney, something dropped from inside the wall. It hit the wooden floor with a dull metallic thud. I looked down and saw an old coffee tin, rusted around the seams, the kind they stopped making decades ago. I sat on the subfloor and carefully pried the lid open. Inside were faded photographs, their edges curled with age. There was my grandmother as a young woman, smiling beside my grandfather. Behind them stood a small white beach house with a brand new porch, untouched by time or storms. Beneath the photographs lay a folded piece of paper, worn soft from years, hidden inside the wall. I recognized Nana's handwriting immediately. It was a list. Things I want before I go. My heartbeat slowed as I unfolded it. Most of the wishes were simple. See all the cousins one more time. Make peace with Wayne. But the first line was underlined twice so deeply the pen had nearly pierced the paper. Watch one more sunset from the porch of a house that's mine. She had hidden the tin inside that wall the year the house was built. It had remained there through foreclosure, through new owners, through years of neglect and decay. No one had ever opened that wall. No one had ever cared enough to reach the bones of the house. Until I did. I sat there until the evening light turned the room orange through the salt-streaked windows. Then I carefully folded the paper, placed it back inside the tin, and closed the lid. At that moment, I knew exactly what I was going to do. I stepped onto the porch I'd rebuilt board by board and called my attorney. I want to establish a life estate, I said. The house stays in my name, but my grandmother has the legal right to live there for the rest of her life. No rent. No conditions. My attorney explained the paperwork. It was simple. It was legal. Most importantly, it was entirely my decision. I had bought that house with my own money, my own hands, and years of relentless work. No one had given it to me. Now I was going to give the best part of it to the only person who had ever truly believed in me. I decided Nana's 80th birthday would be celebrated on this porch, the very porch she'd thought she'd lost forever. I wanted to see the look on her face when she realized she was finally home. And if the rest of the family found out at the same time, so be it. That night I started planning everything. The caterer, chairs, the flowers, string lights along the porch railing. Renata watched me work through the plans and laughed. So you're throwing a party for the people who kicked you out? I shook my head. I'm throwing a party for my grandmother. They just happened to be invited. Right then my phone buzzed. A new inquiry had come through the Titterline website. I rented the restored beach house for small events whenever it wasn't occupied. Normally I skimmed booking requests without much thought. This time I froze. I read the customer's name once. Then again. Carol Sims. My mother. She was trying to rent a beach house for Nana's 80th birthday. She had searched online for the perfect venue. And the website had recommended my house. She had absolutely no idea. The restored photos looked nothing like the abandoned property she remembered. She didn't recognize the home. She didn't recognize that it belonged to me. Renata leaned over my shoulder and let out a long whistle. She's trying to rent your house. For the birthday party you were already planning. In the house her own mother lost, I said quietly. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The situation felt almost impossible. The same woman who had told me my sister deserved a house more than I did was now asking to rent my house without realizing it. There was a version of this story where I replied immediately, where I exposed everything in a single email, where I told her the truth before she ever stepped onto that porch. But I didn't. Not yet. There was a version of this story where I replied immediately. You can't rent a house I own. I could have watched my mother unravel through a screen, but a text message felt too small. What she'd done to me hadn't happened in private. She'd packed my belongings into a box in front of family, neighbors, and anyone willing to watch. If this story was going to end, it wouldn't end with a message. It would end the same way it began, out loud with witnesses. Don't answer yet, I told Renata. I need to think. The truth was, I already knew exactly what I wanted to do. I just needed to make sure I had the courage to see it through. Before I could make a plan, my phone rang. It was Dell. This time his voice was tense. I found out what that bank letter was about, he said. You're not going to like it. He explained everything. 2 years earlier, my mother had opened a home equity line of credit against the Mill Haven house. The money hadn't gone toward repairs. It had gone to Brittany, Cody, his truck, his business idea, the wedding they kept talking about but never seemed able to afford. Because my mother's credit wasn't strong enough, she'd used the only name the bank trusted, mine. She still had copies of my old paperwork from the car loan I co-signed, my social security number, my income information, old signatures. According to Dell, she'd used them to forge my name onto the loan application. I never signed it. I never approved it. But on paper, I was listed as a borrower. The loan had now fallen behind. If it defaulted, both the house and my credit were on the line. Then something clicked. A year earlier, I'd received a strange letter from a lender I didn't recognize. I'd asked my mother about it. She'd smiled and called it junk mail. A pre-approval, she'd said. Throw it away. Something had felt wrong. I'd even called the lender. They told me only the account holder could make changes. The account holder was supposedly my mother. She never followed through. I'd seen the smoke. I'd reached for the alarm. But someone had locked the door before I got there. Now I finally understood. The house they'd thrown me out of had been standing on my name all along. I didn't panic. Panic doesn't solve structural problems. Plans do. The next morning I called my attorney. We approached it exactly the way I approach restoring a damaged house. One step at a time. We obtained copies of the loan documents. Compared the signatures. The forgery was obvious. We matched the application dates against my work records, and proved I had been somewhere else when the paperwork was supposedly signed. Then came the tedious part. A fraud dispute with the lender. An identity theft affidavit. A police report filed in the county where the documents had been submitted. My attorney didn't sugarcoat anything. This is a strong fraud case, she said. But the investigation could take months. The bank won't simply transfer the debt overnight. First we have to prove you were never legally responsible. If the forgery is confirmed, she continued, your name comes off the loan, and the bank pursues whoever actually committed the fraud. I sat quietly after she finished. Putting my mother's name into those documents felt heavier than signing any contract I'd ever written. A year earlier, I probably would have swallowed the debt just to keep the peace. I'd spent too many years believing peace was my responsibility. Not anymore. File everything, I said. So we did. It wasn't dramatic. There were no shouting matches. No courtroom speeches. Just careful paperwork, signatures, evidence, and patience. The kind of work that can't be argued away with tears. Soon enough, my mother would receive a letter informing her that the account was under fraud investigation. For the first time in years, I wasn't quietly cleaning up the mess she'd made. I was letting the truth do the work. Then I turned my attention back to Nana's birthday. I had Renata respond to my mother's booking request through the Titaline business account. My name appeared nowhere in the emails. The beach house was available on the requested date. Our event coordinator, the message explained, would handle all arrangements. My mother happily paid the deposit without asking a single question. She had no idea. She had just rented my house.